I was standing in the marble kitchen of the Hayes estate, while the morning sun of Savannah caught the edges of the antique crystal glasses, which I was meticulously inspecting for the Founders' Day gala. Every glass had to be perfect. As the lead architectural conservator for this family's history, I understood that in this world, even a single smudge was seen as a crack in the foundation. I was polishing a flute from the late 1800s when I heard my husband's sister, Nicole's voice, drift in from the veranda. She wasn't shouting. Her tone was terrifyingly casual, almost cheerful, like she was teaching a simple lesson to a child who just hadn't grasped the basics yet. "You know you're not really ours, right, Madison?" Nicole said, her voice dripping with a sweet, refined poison. I froze, the linen cloth still pressed against the glass. "Ethan isn't your real dad. I know everyone plays pretend, but technically, you're just a placeholder. You don't actually belong to a lineage like this. Not like the other kids." The air in the kitchen suddenly felt heavy, like the humid Georgia heat had finally found a way to suffocate me. The sheer contrast between the sparkling luxury we were preparing for and the calculated brutality of her words made my heart hammer against my ribs. It wasn't just a comment. It was an execution of my daughter's sense of self. Have you ever overheard a family member say something so cruel you could barely believe your ears? Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I want to know who has my back today. I didn't drop the crystal glass. That would have been an emotional reaction, a messy surrender to the shock. Instead, I set it down on the velvet-lined tray. With a click so precise, it sounded like a trigger reset. I didn't ask why she was doing this, and I didn't wait for her to finish. I simply walked through the heavy French doors, onto the veranda. The Savannah air was thick with the scent of jasmine, and the hushed, rhythmic gossip of people who spent their entire lives perfecting their pedigrees. I saw Madison first. She was standing near the stone fountain, her small hand gripping the fabric of her gala dress so hard her knuckles were white. Her face wasn't crumpled in tears. It was blank. It was a hollow, haunting stillness that carries more weight than any scream. I looked at her and felt the weight of the invisible chain. People often think children are just confused when they go silent after a trauma. But as a conservator who spends her days looking at what lies beneath the surface, I know better. That blank stare wasn't confusion. It was a freeze response. It was a silent house of cards she had meticulously built to survive the toxic environment of the Hayes family. By going numb, she was trying to disappear inside herself. It was a psychological defense mechanism where the child becomes a ghost in their own body just to stop the pain of not belonging. She was protecting her soul by shutting the doors. It was a survival skill that no 8-year-old should ever have to master. I didn't rush to her or scoop her up in a display of panic. I needed to be the stone she could lean on. I walked straight to Nicole. She was leaning against the wrought iron railing, a glass of vintage champagne in her hand, looking entirely satisfied with the wreckage she had just caused. She smiled as I approached. It was that practiced, socialite curve of the lips that never reached her eyes. "Oh, Kayla," she said, her voice light and airy. "I was just giving the girl a little bit of historical context. You know how it is. Purity of lineage matters in a house with this much history." I didn't raise my voice. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I reached up and adjusted the silver badge pinned to my lapel. It marked me as the lead architectural conservator of the Hayes estate. "Nicole, put your glass down, walk to your car, and leave this property immediately," I said, keeping my voice low enough that only she could hear the sharp edge of the blade. My voice was as cold and flat as the marble under our feet. Nicole laughed. It was a high-pitched, mocking trill that caused several guests to turn. "Kayla, be realistic. You're just Ethan's wife. You're a guest here by association. You can't kick me out of my own family's Founders' Day celebration." "This house isn't your playground, Nicole," I replied, stepping into her personal space. "This estate is legally owned by the Hayes Family Trust, not any individual. As the lead conservator, I have the authority to remove anyone causing a liability to this monument. If you aren't out of the gates in 5 minutes, I will have the security team, the one that reports directly to me, remove you for trespassing in front of the entire committee." The color drained from her face, leaving her expensive foundation looking like cracked plaster. The socialites nearby stopped mid-sentence. Their curiosity turned into the kind of hushed judgment Nicole feared most. She looked across the lawn for Patricia, her mother, but Patricia was occupied with a senator's wife. She was busy preserving an image that was rapidly becoming a lie. Nicole realized I wasn't bluffing. This wasn't a family squabble. It was a professional eviction. She hissed something about me being an ungrateful interloper, but she moved. I watched her silk dress disappear toward the driveway. The sound of her heels on the gravel sounded like a frantic retreat. I turned back to my daughter. The sun was still shining over Savannah, but the polished facade of the Hayes family was already starting to shatter. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. And the Hayes family was about to realize they were deep in the red. The evening air in Madison's room was still. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic ticking of a vintage clock I had restored myself. I tucked the sheets around her, watching the blankness in her eyes slowly give way to a heavy, exhausted sleep. I didn't whisper sweet nothings about how everything would be fine. I didn't offer empty promises. In this house, promises were just bad debts. I sat in the armchair by the window, staring at the darkened garden where, only hours ago, the Hayes lineage had been used as a blade to cut my daughter's heart. I looked at my hands, still smelling faintly of lavender and old parchment. For 6 years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family. I was the one who spent 12-hour days in the unventilated archives, piecing together the Hayes' crumbling 18th century history to ensure they remained relevant to the Savannah Historical Society. I had meticulously restored the reputation. It was a task that Nicole and Patricia treated like a basic utility, always on, never valued, and certainly never paid for. The Hayes Family Legacy Trust was valued at precisely $25 million. To Nicole, that money was a subscription to a lifestyle she hadn't earned. It was a way to fund her designer wardrobe and her unearned sense of superiority. To me, it was a balance sheet that had been ignored for far too long. I had been footing the bill for their emotional bankruptcy. I provided the labor and the legitimacy that kept the estate from falling into obscurity. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, assuming the line of credit was infinite. I realized then that this was the trap of normalized cruelty. In high society, families like the Hayeses, lineage is more than a biological fact. It is a currency used to maintain a monopoly on power. They don't just exclude you. They dehumanize you to ensure their own status remains elevated. By telling an 8-year-old she was a placeholder, Nicole wasn't just being honest. She was performing a hostile takeover of a child's identity to protect her own share of the legacy. It is a system designed to make the outsider feel subhuman, ensuring that the hierarchy remains unchallenged. They thought I was part of the background. They thought I was a tool they could use to polish their history without ever becoming part of it. They were wrong. This wasn't a family drama anymore. This was a forensic audit of their entire existence. I had spent years analyzing the cracks in the Hayes Foundation, and I knew exactly which stone to pull to bring the whole structure down. Nicole thought she was the gatekeeper of this lineage, but I was the one who held the ledgers. She had underestimated the outsider she had been using as a footstool. As I sat in the dark, watching my daughter breathe, I didn't feel sadness. I felt the cold, sharp precision of an architect who had just found a lethal flaw in the design. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. And by the time I was finished, the Hayes family would realize that their blood currency was worth absolutely nothing. The Spanish moss in the garden seemed to droop with the weight of the family's silence. Nicole wasn't going to apologize. That would require a conscience, which was a liability she couldn't afford on her balance sheet. Instead, she chose to double down on her investment in cruelty. By Monday morning, the humid air of Savannah was thick with whispers. Nicole had gone straight to the Founders' Day committee. She didn't yell. She used a more effective weapon. She used concern. She told them I was unstable. She claimed I was suffering from a psychological breakdown and that I was trying to kidnap the family trust. To the elite of the city, I was just the girl from the outside who had married into the Hayes name, a variable they were more than happy to delete from the social equation. Then the phone rang. It was Patricia. Her voice was a masterclass in high society passive aggression, draped in the ritual of Savannah etiquette. "Kayla, dear," she said, her tone as sharp and cold as a diamond needle. "We really need to talk about your recent behavior. You've created quite a mess." Nicole is absolutely devastated, and frankly, we're all worried about your state of mind. She wasn't looking for a resolution. She was enforcing a hierarchy. She spent 10 minutes explaining that Nicole was just being realistic about the lineage, and that I had overstepped my bounds as an outsider who simply married into the name. She reminded me that I was a guest in their history. I was a temporary resident who was expected to know my place. It was a verbal eviction notice. delivered with a smile I could practically hear through the receiver. I didn't argue, I didn't cry. I listened to her use the language of family unity to justify the dehumanization of my daughter. I realized then that my relationship with the Hayes family had been a subscription I'd been footing the bill for, and they had just increased the price of my dignity. This was no longer just a backyard argument. It had transformed into a social fight for survival. It was a battle over who got to define the truth of our home. They were willing to bankrupt my reputation to protect their $25 million legacy. But as a conservator, I knew that the grander the facade, the more likely the foundation was rotting. I didn't answer a single one of their follow-up texts. I went back to my archives. I wasn't just looking for history anymore. I was looking for the kill shot. Ethan returned home late that evening. The smell of rain and old cedar was clinging to his coat. He didn't ask about the gala, or why the house felt like a crime scene. I didn't give him an emotional summary. I simply handed him my phone like a forensic report, and let the recording of Nicole's voice fill the room. He listened in a silence so profound, it felt heavy. When the recording finished, he didn't yell or throw things. He sat down at the mahogany dining table. His face was as still as a statue in his museum. He looked at me, and then he looked toward the stairs where Madison was sleeping. And I saw the shift. The curator was no longer protecting a legacy. He was preparing to dismantle a fraud. Family is a choice, Kayla, Ethan said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a final judgment. And Nicole just chose to be a stranger. He didn't mention her blood or their shared history. To Ethan, a man who spent his life discerning the authentic from the counterfeit, Nicole had just proven she was a fake. He didn't hesitate. He reached for his laptop and accessed the digital archives of the Savannah City Museum, the restricted vaults that held the Hayes family records dating back to the late 1700s. He wasn't just my husband in that moment. He was a high-level strategist with the keys to the kingdom. We drove to the museum under the cover of a midnight drizzle. The building was a fortress of marble and shadow. Inside the climate-controlled vault, surrounded by the preserved remnants of the city's elite, Ethan began a professional audit of the Hayes lineage. He bypassed the public family trees and went straight to the private legal binders. These were the documents that hadn't seen the light of day in 40 years. Nicole had spent her life weaponizing her biological purity, but as Ethan turned the yellowed pages of a confidential legal ward ledger, the glass facade of her identity shattered. The kill shot was written in plain legal ink from 40 years ago. Nicole was never a biological Hayes. She was a secret private adoption, processed through an out-of-state agency and kept under an ironclad non-disclosure agreement to protect the Hayes bloodline from the stain of her origin. She was the very thing she had used to humiliate my daughter, an outsider allowed in. But the audit didn't stop at her birth. Ethan pulled up the most recent audit logs for the Hayes Family Legacy Trust. He found a discrepancy that totaled precisely $2,500,000. Nicole had been bleeding the trust dry to cover her mounting social debts and her failing investments. But she hadn't done it legally. Ethan zoomed in on a scanned withdrawal slip from 6 months ago. The signature belonged to Patricia. But as a curator trained to spot the subtle tremor of a forged line, Ethan saw the truth. Nicole had forged her own mother's signature to embezzle the money. The truth teller, who had called my daughter a placeholder, was actually a criminal fraud who was one bank audit away from a prison cell. I didn't feel a single spark of pity. I looked at the screen, at the numbers and the legal ward papers, and I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a balanced ledger. We weren't just in-laws anymore. We were the executioners. The doorbell rang at 6 in the evening. The sound was sharp, piercing the silence of our home like an alarm. I looked through the peephole and saw Nicole. She looked nothing like the polished socialite who had stood on the veranda 3 days ago. Her hair was frantic, her designer coat was rumpled, and her eyes were rimmed with a raw, desperate red. I opened the door, just enough to see the wreck of her composure. She didn't wait for me to speak. "Ethan, Kayla, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking in a way that would have moved me a year ago. The bank called. "They're questioning a transfer from 6 months ago. The Founders Day Committee. They're hearing rumors about my debts. You have to help me. We're family. We can find a family solution to this before it goes public." I didn't reach out to comfort her. I didn't offer her a chair or a glass of water. I simply pulled a thick manila envelope from the console table behind me. "It's interesting that you use the word family now, Nicole," I said. My voice was calm, factual, and lethal. "Usually, your version of family is a gated community where people like my daughter aren't allowed to live. You were very clear about that on the veranda." Nicole shook her head. her tears smudging her expensive mascara. I was stressed. I didn't mean it like that. Please, Kayla, if Patricia finds out about the trust discrepancies, she'll disown me. I'll lose everything. You already lost it, Nicole, I replied. I handed her the first document from the envelope, the certified copy of the legal ward ledger from 40 years ago. You spent your entire life selling a lie about your biological purity just to make a child feel subhuman. You called an 8-year-old a placeholder, but here is your true context. You weren't born into this lineage. You were a secret legal ward, an outsider allowed in under a non-disclosure agreement. By your own logic, you never actually belonged here. She stared at the paper, the color leaving her face so quickly she had to lean against the doorframe for support. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The truth-teller had finally run out of lies. Before she could recover, I handed her the second set of papers, the forged audit logs for the Hayes Family Legacy Trust. And this is the $2,500,000 you embezzled using your mother's forged signature. Nicole looked up. Her lips were trembling as she clutched the evidence of her fraud. You can't do this. It will destroy the Hayes name. Ethan would never let his own sister go to prison. Think about the family reputation. I looked her in the eyes, feeling the absolute clarity of an architect who had just finished a controlled demolition. You said truth matters above all else, Nicole. Well, here is yours. And as for Ethan, he's the one who found the ward papers. He realized that loyalty is a craft, not a blood type. He chose his daughter, which means he's officially closed your account. I saw the realization hit her the exact moment the balance sheet of her life went to zero. I've already notified the trust board, and our attorneys are handing over the full dossier of your fraud to the district attorney's office as we speak, I said. There is no family solution for a crime. Goodbye, Nicole. I stepped back and closed the heavy oak door. The deadbolt clicked into place with a heavy, metallic thud that sounded exactly like a gavel hitting a bench. The long standing of Nicole Hayes was over, and the silence that followed was the first real peace I had felt in years. The cicadas in the old oaks have finally stopped their screaming. In their place is a soft evening breeze that smells of salt and rain-drenched jasmine. The Hayes estate still stands. Its stone walls are as imposing as ever, but the air inside is different now. It is lighter. It no longer feels like a place where you have to hold your breath just to survive the atmospheric pressure of other people's expectations. Nicole is gone. The legal battle was swift and decisive, because when a foundation is built entirely on lies, it doesn't take much more than the truth to make the whole structure collapse. She was officially ousted from the Hayes Family Legacy Trust. The $25 million she once treated like a personal subscription to vanity has been redirected. It is now being used for actual historical preservation and to fund educational grants for children who have been told their whole lives that they don't quite fit the mold. I watched Madison this afternoon in the museum gardens. She was walking side by side with Ethan, her small hand tucked into his, as he explained the history of a statue they were restoring. She didn't look blank. She didn't look like a ghost wandering through her own life. When Ethan introduced her to a visiting scholar as his daughter, she didn't flinch. She didn't look for an escape route. She simply smiled and started telling the woman about the archival boxes she had helped us organize that morning. My heart didn't ache this time. It felt full. Madison is learning that her name isn't a placeholder, and her existence isn't a variable in someone else's social equation. She is the truest lineage this family has seen in 100 years. Her character is built on resilience and kindness, not just the coincidence of shared chemistry. Looking back at that day on the veranda, I've come to realize that blood is just a biological fact, but family is an intentional choice. It's a craft you perfect through every doctor's appointment you attend, every bedtime story you read, and every time you choose to be the shield between your child and a cruel world. If you find yourself in a similar situation, if you've ever been the outsider or the interloper in a house that refused to see your value, I want you to know that you don't need their permission to exist. You certainly don't need their validation to be whole. I want to speak directly to those of you who've always felt like you were standing on the edge of the circle, watching everyone else belong. Maybe you've spent years making yourself smaller, hoping that if you took up less space, they might finally find room for you. Maybe you've been told that your worth is tied to a name or a bloodline that you don't share. Please listen to me when I say this. Their inability to see you is their deficit, not yours. You are not a placeholder for a love they aren't capable of giving. Forgiveness is a word people throw around a lot to make victims feel guilty for enforcing their boundaries. But I've learned that real forgiveness isn't always about the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from the heavy debt of their approval. It means looking at the balance sheet of a toxic relationship and deciding to write it off as a total loss, so you can stop wasting your emotional capital. It means realizing that a home isn't defined by the portraits on the wall, but by the safety you feel when you walk through the door. You are enough. You have always been enough. You don't need a pristine pedigree or $1 million trust to be worthy of a life where you are loved, respected, and chosen every single day. The courage to walk away from people who refuse to value you is the first step toward building a legacy that is actually worth keeping. If this story reminded you that you are enough, please share it. Let's remind everyone that family is where we choose to belong, not where we are forced to stay. Don't forget to subscribe to hear more tales of justice and the heart.